Organizations are now dealing with far more dynamic and evolving risks, whether it's the data privacy breaches, ethical decision making, misuse of AI tools, or workplace conduct issues.
Organizations make this mistake assuming that compliance is a knowledge problem. They see it as a knowledge problem. But if you see in reality, it's a decision-making problem.
In real life, people don't always have clear answers. So instead of expecting perfection from them, we should equip them with a simple thinking tool. Pause, question, validate, and escalate if needed. Because confidence does not really come from knowing every policy, but it comes from knowing how to navigate uncertainty responsibly.
Measuring learning events, we should be measuring the decision quality.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode by Stratbeans. Let me start with a quick thought. For years, compliance training had a reputation problem. Employees saw it as that annual training module that I need to finish before the deadline. Leaders saw it as a proof that we did what was required, and L&D teams often got measured on one thing: completion. But the workplace today has changed. Today, one wrong decision, one missed policy, one careless data sharing movement, or one ignored ethical red flag can become a business risk. So maybe the real question is not, did employee complete the compliance training? The better question is, what is compliance training telling us about workforce risk? This is exactly what we are exploring today in our episode. Beyond the checkbox, how compliance training is becoming workforce risk intelligence. Joining us today is Saurabh Jain, an experienced learning and development professional who has worked across diverse industries, gaining deep expertise in employee training, capability building, and organizational learning. Over the years, Saurabh has contributed to designing and delivering impactful learning initiatives across multiple sectors, helping teams adapt to evolving business needs, regulatory expectations, and compliance requirements. Currently working as a compliance training manager, Saurabh specializes in driving awareness around regulatory standards, ethical practices, and corporate compliance through learning programs that are practical, engaging, and relevant to real workplace behavior. What makes his perspective especially valuable is his cross-industry experience. He understands that compliance is not just a policy conversation. It is a people, culture, and decision-making conversation. Saurabh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Anusha. Really glad to be here. I think the way you framed it is actually very important because compliance today is no longer just about policies or checklists. So I'm really excited to explore this today. Thank you.
We also have with us Mr. Prasoon Nigam, CTO and co-founder at Stratbeans, and an expert in articulate-based learning design, digital learning architecture, and model learning experiences. Prasoon has worked closely on building interactive, scenario-led, and technology-enabled learning experiences that move beyond just static slides. His perspective will help us understand how tools like Articulate can make compliance training more realistic, measurable, and action-oriented. Prasoon, it's so great to have you here as well.
Thank you, Danusha. I'm really looking forward to this great discussion with Saurabh. I'm sure we're gonna be learning a lot, and maybe a few points we'll share will be of use. Yeah.
Let me dive to the first question that I have for you, Saurabh. Let us start with the big shift. For a long time, compliance training was treated as a mandatory activity. But today, organizations are dealing with much more complex risks like data privacy, workplace ethics, AI usage, and more. In your experience, what exactly is changing now? Why is compliance training moving from a checkbox activity to something that can actually reveal a workforce risk?
Well, that's a great question, Tanusha. And before I get into that, just a quick note that these will be my personal views based on my experience, so they don't really represent any organization that I've worked with. I think the shift we are seeing is quite fundamental. For a very long time, compliance training was treated as a tick-the-box exercise, something employees had to complete annually just to meet the regulatory requirements. the focus was largely on completion rates rather than actual understanding or behavioral impact. But what is changing now is the risk environment itself. Organizations are now dealing with far more dynamic and evolving risks, whether it's the data privacy breaches, ethical decision making, misuse of AI tools, or workplace conduct issues. And we have already seen how real this is. If you look at major data privacy breaches globally, very often the root cause is not just system failure, it's human behavior. Someone clicking on the wrong link, unintentionally sharing the sensitive data, or bypassing the process. That's exactly where compliance training, or the lack of it, translates directly into risk. Because most compliance failures don't start as violations, they start as small everyday decisions. So today, these are not risks that can be managed purely through policies. They are fundamentally human behavior risks, and that's where training comes critical. It's no longer just about what employees know, but increasingly about how they think or act in the real situation. And the second biggest shift is around the data and insights. Earlier, training effectively ended once someone completed a module. But today, organizations are looking much deeper. How are employees responding to the real life scenarios? Where are the knowledge gaps or risky decision patterns emerging? Which teams or geographies show higher exposure to certain risks? This is what transforms training into a diagnostic tool, almost like an early warning system for workforce risk. And finally, there is a growing recognition that compliance is not just a legal function. It's deeply connected to culture, trust, and organizational resilience. If employees are not truly internalizing things like ethical behavior, respectful workplaces, or responsible AI use, those risks can escalate very quickly into larger issues. So in essence, compliance training is evolving from a static one-time activity into a continuous intelligence mechanism, one that helps organizations proactively identify, measure, mitigate workforce risks before it becomes an incident. Thank you.
Thank you, Saurabh. I think a great start to this conversation because you maybe underlined the most important aspect, that is the human behavior, and sometimes that becomes the root cause. So Prasoon, now I would like to bring you here because a lot of compliance training still looks like slide after slide of policy explanation followed by a general quiz. But tools like Articulate can help create branching scenarios, knowledge checks, and quick reinforcement experiences. From your perspective, how can Articulate be used to turn compliance training into something more interactive and more intelligence driven?
So, Tanusha, let me pick up a figure first to set the gravity of the compliance failures. So, the data that I have is that in 2024, which is about 2 years back, around 19.3 billion were the fines, global regulatory fines in financial crimes, compliance failures, governance breaches. And what do you think? I mean, this number is only going to go up now because of newer ways in which compliance can be breached. Now, the reason I brought in this data before articulating about Articulate was because Articulate is a solution to a problem. But if we don't understand the problem well enough and we jump to the solution, it may not be appreciated much. So therefore, I want to take that liberty of setting a little bit of stage. And I think Saurabh has already answered some of the great points around how it is no more just a checklisting. Like he said something very interesting towards the end of his previous interaction, that it is no more static, it is continuous. This threat or this opportunity to contain the compliance is continuous now. And organizations make this mistake assuming that compliance is a knowledge problem. They see it as a knowledge problem. But if you see in reality, it's a decision-making problem. I mean, let's say somebody, an employee, he wants to know that can I share this customer data, or I'm getting this nice gift from a vendor, doesn't appear to be too expensive. Who opens a policy document and checks for it? It doesn't happen in practical. So the idea is that you have to change the way in which policy or compliance material have been handled. Initially it used to be you have this policy material and then you press next to get few more angles to that, and then few more angles, and then finally there is a quiz. And this is now like a huge recipe for failure if people continue to use it. So newer model is that you give them a situation, you give them the probable choices to choose from, and once they make a choice, what are the consequences, and more important, once you have a consequence, a reflection, and then a reinforcement. So this is the right framework if decision making is the key for all the compliance thing that we want to do. Now, since your question was around articulate, the days for mentioning that 95% of the course has been completed is of no use in most of the cases when you're talking about especially the compliance issues. What you may have that underneath that 95 completion, and you are very happy about it as management, you may have situation where maybe 28% of your finance managers still incorrectly approve a conflict of interest scenario, and that's valuable because that is where an intervention can happen. That's a business insight. So landing now to the articulate. So articulate is one of the very potent tools where you could create such situations where somebody is subjected to those situations and they can do this situation choice, consequence, reflection and reinforcement. And the basic engine of creating branching scenario, a branching conversation is at the back of it. It could be an email simulation, it could be this AI policy advisory, it could be some time-based decision you may have to take, a manager's conversation, some kind of a remediation that has to be done in an adaptive way. And every click that you are doing on that as a learner would become a data point into the risk portfolio for your company. So completion rates are not really that important now, but how you create your scenarios, how well they are designed, are they allowing people to getting exposed to various consequences. Very important is also that the data should be taken from whatever previous instances or any deterrence that have been done in terms of a violation, and scenarios be created. Now again, Articulate with its newer AI version allows you that supersonic speed, if I may, of creating such scenarios, because scenarios are quite intense to create. We all will agree, whoever have made it, it's a tree and it's keep getting bigger and bigger, and more scenarios you add, it becomes tougher to make them. But thanks to the AI features available within the tool natively now, you could pick up that exercise and get on a very high velocity. You may, let's say we're taking 15 days to turn around good quality 2-3 scenarios. Now you could probably do it in a day, assisted with AI. So yeah, I think those are the important angles. And the last one I must mention, which increases the scale. So it may happen that in a lot of firms, English may not be the primary language of thinking. So imagine a sales agent for a credit card, for example. Under the IRDA regulation, everything, all those compliances, converting that course into a language that you understand, to localize that and translate, again, Articulate gives you a huge win because of this very integrated localization technology available. With a press of button, with very less hassle, you could spin out the same branching scenario now in a different context. Yeah, I think the whole idea for all of us in the industry is to reduce what we don't want to be contributing directly or to this 19.3 billion regulatory fines. In fact, we would like to save our organization and our people from doing it one way or the other. So that's how I see it. That's how Articulate plays a very prominent role. If you have decided to create simulations and scenarios, that could be the tool of choice.
Great to hear that, and thanks for bringing that actual and factual data to the conversation, Prasoon, because that would really be an eye-opener to many people listening to our conversation today, and that would really insist them to make the decisions in the right path. But now over to you, Saurabh. I would really like to bring this conversation that compliance training can easily become dry because employees often think that I already know this, or this is just a policy language. or I'll just click through and finish it. But the real compliance issues that really happen, they don't really happen in textbook situations. They happen in those gray areas where there is a small data sharing request, there's a manager pushing for numbers, or a conflict of interest, or a workplace conduct issue. So, how can compliance training become more real, more relatable, and more human in your experience?
This is something we discuss quite frequently within our teams as well. If I simplify it, there are three critical things that teams designing compliance training need to get right today. First is shifting from policy-heavy content to scenario-based learning. Traditional training is very linear and predictable, but real compliance risks do not happen that way. They happen in ambiguous high-pressure situations. So instead of just saying, here is the policy, we need to put employees into the realistic situations like you said, a manager under pressure to meet targets or a colleague requesting sensitive data, maybe just to help the customer. When you ask employees, what would you do here? That's when the real thinking begins. Second is making training role specific and contextual. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work anymore. The risks a sales team faces are very different from finance, HR, or tech. When employees see scenarios that reflect their day-to-day reality, engagement automatically goes up because it feels relevant, not generic. And the third one is making training interactive and decision-driven, not passive. Instead of just clicking through the slides, employees should make choices, see consequences, and understand why a decision is risky, not just that it is. And this is where tools like Articulate or similar platforms help. They allow us to design branching scenarios, which Prasoon also spoke about just now, where each decision leads to a different outcome. And what that does is it shifts training from knowledge testing to judgment building. Because most compliance failures are not due to lack of knowledge. They are due to humans, how humans make decisions under pressure. And if you look at it psychologically, we know this, that people don't make decisions purely rationally. They are influenced by urgency, authority, social pressure, or even the desire to help sometimes. So compliance risk is not just a knowledge problem, it's a human behavioral problem. In fact, good employees don't take risks intentionally. Risk happens when good intentions meet the poor judgment. Let me share a quick example to bring this to life. In one scenario-based module, employees were asked if they would share the customer data with a colleague who urgently needed it to close a deal. And interestingly, many initially chose to share it because it felt like helping a teammate or achieving a business goal. But when the scenario showed the consequences like data breach risk, regulatory penalties, and impact on customer trust, people actually paused and reflected. And in the follow-up discussions, many of them admitted that they have done it or they might have made the same decision without even thinking in their prior experience. That's the power of this approach. It doesn't just test knowledge, it reveals how easily good intentions can also lead to a risky decision. And that's really the shift from training people on policies to preparing them for decisions. Thank you.
Great perspective. I think the real case scenarios that you will share or that you are continuously sharing, that would be very relatable to people who are currently in this industry, and they will also find some more learnings accordingly. Prasoon, I'll just direct this one more question to you. So suppose if an organization creates scenario-based compliance training, it can actually start seeing those patterns, like which departments are choosing risky options, what are the roles that might need more support, and which are the topics that are misunderstood, and where are the learners feeling more overconfident. So how can technology help L&D and compliance team move from basic reporting to more meaningful insights?
Anusha, we used a word that currently, rather than a completion tracking, we have to shift towards a risk intelligence system. So you have to catch those vectors which are not limited with just completion. And I'll try and answer what are the opportunities, what are the kind of cuts we can get from the data so as to have a meaningful insight into your risk temperature, as in what is the probability that in future your organization or a part of your organization can land into risk. And I would totally agree with the point, and it's so obvious also in that sense what Saurabh said, that it it is so varied. It has got so many cuts and layers. For example, an HR risk would be maybe very different than a finance team's risk, than a tech team risk, or a different teams expose themselves to different kind of risk. Now, I would take my favorite analogy, which is around the X-ray machines. So long back, X-ray machines were created, and it was a super success, because now suddenly with a little, radiation, you could find out fractures in your bone, you could figure out issues in your tissues, and it was very useful. It was almost similar to the completion training that we do today. And just like in all technology, we reach a point of saturation where this technology was not very useful in some more wider scenario, just like we are facing right now when we talk about risk intelligence. So what really happened, that after X-ray, CT scan came in, and the basis of CT scan was that it would take the X-ray from different angles, and then it would reconstruct a 3D image. So now suddenly, rather than being limited to 2D, you may have a 3D perspective of what's going on, and you could discover more complex fractures, more complex tumors and scenarios which cannot otherwise would have been discovered. So bringing it back to our current discussion, the content and also the system, like a learning management system where these contents are hosted, and other technologies which are very symbiotic to your LMS, all the AI things, they all have to come in a formation such that it becomes a CT scan now for risk intelligence. Such that a question like who is likely to make a risky decision, which department is more likely to take a risky decision, which zone in your company, because the beauty of human variety is such that certain kind of risk may appear in certain cultures or complex construct. Even culture also plays a role. So you need that kind of a CT scan to be able to see. And do you think just how 95% completion by the entire staff will give you anything? No, not really. So basically, let's count some of the very obvious intelligence scores that you would like to bring in. Now, a regular quiz that you are giving on compliance, or this whole scenario-based assessment, or even a regular quiz that you may have, you could look at what is the first choice accuracy. Because what happens when people are doing an MCQ, imagine there are 4 options, they make the first choice, and then they think, and then probably they move to second. These are small quote-unquote CT scan signals that you can catch. The confidence versus correctness. So there's a paragraph of text, it will take a certain amount of time to be read. So your time to attempt can never be 0, because if somebody just reads and clicks, they are just playing the odds, because there are 4 questions, so probability is always very high, 25% to be correct. So confidence versus correctness is another signal. And all these things are not rocket science, they're all available. These things were already there, but they were never seen as a useful signal. They were seen as noises. Nobody used to really capture these things. Then number of hints used. So if the person is taking a lot of hints, it has a story to tell. And of course, did they decide correctly? Finally, the result, did they repeat on a mistake? So many times organizations give these trainings to be redone, and it should be done like that. People are actually, even after reading, they're doing the same mistake or similar mistake, has a story to tell again. And then LMS system, so easy to categorize various kind of learning into different risk categories. So imagine the system where tools like Articulate will quickly spin off a lot of different scenarios. Now these scenarios have to come from the signals from the market, because there are infinite things you can create, but that will not help you. So 2 important considerations, very logical. The kind of risk that you have already faced in past. Maybe there have been some compliance issues you already had. That should become an input. Second input is that maybe the risks have not matured, but you have this feeling as an organization that these are newly exposed risks. There's a chances that maybe in similar organization it is happening. So it could probably happen to you. Now with that intuition, you can really churn out a lot of scenario-based learning, and you could then start putting them in the system, categorizing them in a different way, and then you would have the 3D reconstruction of the CT scan, as I was saying, where you will, rather than one side of the X-ray will tell you that it is 99% completion, scores are 94% perfect. But when you turn on the CT scan mode, you will have that 42% are still, like Saurabh mentioned, a scenario like that they still will share customer data with a third party. Now this is invisible in your traditional LMS because those signals were never captured. They were like those old X-ray machines. And now you bring in AI angle to it. Earlier, let me tell you, it used to be difficult. There used to be separate analytics team who used to sit on this data and put it into Excel sheet, move it to SPSS. There used to be this popular program, and then they will do their analysis. Now it becomes all that easy. You could get very easily without engaging all that horsepower with a little bit of AI. Which department is overconfident? Which locations struggle with ethics, past data, current data, and future signals? Which manager's team shows highest risk? Which policy generates maximum wrong decision? So even this holy grail of policy may have gaps. How would you know that? So these are done through, and it's very self-supporting. So whatever analytics data you get not only helps containing the risk, but it also in fact allow you to fix holes in your policies. So it's a beautiful kind of a loop which can be made use of. So essentially we shouldn't be measuring learning events, we should be measuring the decision quality. And I think that is where all the systems, even for our firm, has been in the compliance track for a very long time. And these ideas were discussed in the early days when this GPT used to come, that these are the possibilities, and these were included, and we found that our clients benefited with it to a reasonable degree because it's the CT scan now. It's not the regular data that you may see. And the last analogy would be that this is how look at digital flight simulators. You cannot have pilots learn everything by manual. They're very complex and they're very situation based. So what they do, they sit in a simulator and they repeatedly make decision under pressure, time pressure, or they would create certain immersive environments. So employees should also experience the same. Rather than saying read policy number 7.3 section 1, it should be like you should experience this thing. Your biggest clients wants an exception. Now what would you do? And AI can observe. I'm going little beyond, in the sense not limited by Articulate or LMS. There are other technologies which will also help you observe your hesitation, your overconfidence, your reasoning swings, and your decision pattern. And you will have a very strong predictive system which can say, okay, now you're safe, you're within a limit in terms of your risk exposure. So I think that is the data analytics, the right data analytics for the intelligence. And I think all the organizations which are sitting on this completion rate high time, we should move ahead of it.
I think that's very well put, and I think the key takeaway there will be when we start treating training as a safe space to fail and learn. That's when it truly becomes a tool for managing future risk. And yes, at a broader level, we do see these patterns emerging. Without going into specifics, what becomes clear is that certain types of decision tend to repeat, not because people don't know the policy, but because of context, pressure, and how the situation is perceived. So thank you.
Yeah, safe space. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
I think Saurabh, like Prasoon mentioned about the geographies, the kind of departments, the people. So I think in your experience also, you must come across certain kind of situations like where you identify, okay, this is the region that is lacking this kind of discipline, or this is the region or this is the department that needs more attention. So you must also have those kind of data with you, and that would be really helpful in making those kind of decisions while training. So I'll move to the next question that I have for you is, how can artificial intelligence help create those training that feel like, okay, this is my job? And what's the risk of letting AI generate the content without human oversight?
Wow, thank you. I think everybody is talking about it these days. I think this is exactly where AI can really change the game for compliance training. One of the biggest changes in compliance has always been relevance. Employees often feel that this does not apply to me. And that's where AI adds the real value. It allows us to create hyper-personalized role-specific learning at scale. Instead of a generic module, a sales employee might see scenarios around target pressure, and client interactions. A tech employee might deal with data handling or AI usage, and a manager might face workplace conduct dilemmas. When training reflects their real world context, it suddenly shifts from theoretical content to something practical and relatable. And this is something I might actually face. AI also allows the training to become adaptive. If someone struggles with certain decisions or concepts, it can reinforce those areas with additional scenarios or nudges. So it becomes more like a guided learning journey rather than a one time module. But the second part of your question is equally important, the risk of AI or using AI without a human oversight. Compliance is a high stakes function. We are dealing with ethics, regulatory requirements, and increasingly dynamic topics like AI usage or sanctions, which can change based on the global events. If AI generated content is not reviewed carefully, it can oversimplify complex policies and miss critical legal nuances, or even create scenarios that are not appropriate for the organization's context. There is also a subtle risk. AI may optimize for engagement, but in compliance, accuracy matters more than engagement. So the key is to treat AI as an enabler, not really as a decision maker. Exactly as Prasoon mentioned earlier. Human expertise is still essential to validate the content, ensure regulatory alignment, or bring the right organizational context into the learning experience. In simple terms, AI helps us scale relevance and personalization, but human judgment ensures accuracy, credibility, and accountability. Because in compliance, a small error in training can become a very large risk in reality. And in a function like compliance, getting something wrong is far more expensive than taking a little extra time to get it right.
You made a very important point, which actually adds on to the adaptive the aspect of AI. I think that is again a very low hanging fruit available for AI systems in doing that hyper personalization, because every person brings in a set of risk into the organization. And if you see that certain patterns exist, you keep vaccinating that person again and again with a similar content. And that is where in past it was difficult, because it is one size fits all content, because it's very costly to make such content, so you cannot really have varieties. But now micro learning, that is what came to my mind, that you could immediately spin off a micro learning for that person from that section 7.3, one more scenario, bringing in a twist, also giving it to the prompt, this previous failure of this person, reshaping the scenario and checking whether the person has reached that zone of compliance. So yeah, I think adaptive part was really striking, Saurabh.
Absolutely. And that's where the real power lies. When you bring together the performance data, behavioral signals, and learning insights, you're no longer just training employees, you're actually predicting where risk would emerge. And that's a completely different level of maturity for organizations.
I think a very important discussion on the usage of AI that we have heard a lot of times in the recent past, or in all the conversation and all the summits that are being held on. But it's very important that the real noise should also be made about the ethical use of it, or the matured use of it, how we should use that. So apart from compliance, any such instances, Prasoon, that you might have incurred, or any such story that you would like to share with us?
So like with all fast cars, as I say, it's a joy, but all precautions you have to take, you are responsible for all the accidents. So that's the basic framework of using AI. At the same time, AI does bring in, because of so it's a very ironical trade-off, what we call as hallucination can be very good for creative side, because imagine AI hallucinates and, creates a new image for you, it's beautiful. But if it does the same hallucination for a very exact science like a compliance, that is no more an art, that's a kind of an accident. So the current AI comes packaged with hallucination. So the creativity is blessed, but exactness is cursed. Now, what do we do about it? Assuming you're not a creative guy, you would make sure that you let AI be a great, give all the liberty to give it more tokens to crunch, be with them in terms of creating. But checker has to be you. You have to finally come and see that 1,000 lines of thing that it has spurted out. You have to see that, and you have to really sign it up as a person in the compliance department. So that's the way. And even otherwise, even in code generation, where it's the biggest success of AI has been, it is threatening developers. There are a lot of issues around. If the people don't check that code, then the same thing can lead to newer security issues. And people understand now what kind of code AI generates. So there's a different set of hackers who are after you. They know what kind of patterns would be used. Now coming back to the last example of how to contain such ethical risk. So one of the things that have been mandated in the industry is that if a tool is generating an image, it should mark that it is AI generated. So there is one kind of a risk that is covered. Especially, I think European Union is coming with or already enforced that declaration that any content which has been generated with AI has to mark, especially in the multimedia, that is AI generated. Because there's a lot of, you all are aware of such stories where these images can lead to certain violations and copyright issues. So I think it has always happened with technology. It comes along with some kind of a challenges, newer compliances, and the data is that currently about $9 billion is the size of all the compliance training market, right? And about 14 years as you move ahead in time, you reach 2030, is going to be close to 13 to 14 billion dollar. So it's an upward trend. But to my mind, though I may not be an expert, people actually sit down and tabulate such data. It could be even bigger, area of investment, because of the newer angles which we are not even aware. Next 6 months, what kind of tools will come? What kind of magic will it give you? And at the same time, what kind of curves you have to now handle in terms of compliance and regulation? But interesting enough, we'll all come together and solve it. That's where newer solutions will be built.
Right. So that also brings me to the last question that I have for you today, Saurabh. That if compliance training is no longer just about, I completed the course, but more about I know what to do when the moment gets messy. What is the one big shift that the organizations must make to turn employees from just policy readers into confident decision makers?
Okay, I think I'll build on the analogy that Prasoon shared earlier about moving from an X-ray to an MRI. So if I had to summarize one big shift, it would be that organizations need to move from training people on policies to training people on judgment. Because traditionally, compliance training assumes that if people know the rules, they will do the right thing. But in reality, compliance is not tested in perfect situations. It's tested in messy ones. Most risks don't appear as clear violations. They show up as a gray area decision, often under pressure, time constraints, or competing priorities. So the real shift is designing training that builds decision-making confidence, not just awareness. And what does that look like in practice? I would summarize it in 3 simple ways. First, move from theory to real situations. Instead of explaining the policies, we need to immerse employees in realistic scenarios. For example, imagine a manager working under pressure to close the quarter, and the workaround is suggested that technically bends a rule but helps achieve the target. So instead of saying this is wrong, we ask, what would you do? That's where the real thinking begins. And second, focus on the why, not just the rule. Policy do not drive behavior. Understanding intent does. When employees understand that sharing customer data is not just a violation, but something that impacts trust, regulatory exposure, and reputation, they're far more likely to apply judgment even in the new situations. And last one is normalize uncertainty and equip decision frameworks. In real life, people don't always have clear answers. So instead of expecting perfection from them, we should equip them with a simple thinking tool. Pause, question, validate, and escalate if needed. Because confidence does not really come from knowing every policy, but it comes from knowing how to navigate uncertainty responsibly. If you think about it more philosophically, most difficult decisions in life are not between right and wrong. They're between what is easier and what is right. And let me quickly bring this to life with a simple example. In one scenario, employees were asked if they would share the customer data with a colleague, the same example that I discussed earlier. If you remember, a large number of employees initially said yes, and they actually shared it. And this is not in the entire industry. This was a survey done with the global employees. And the result was 87.79% employees actually realize that they might have taken the same decision in their past experience as well. So that moment was powerful because it showed the risk is not just about it's not just about the lack of knowledge, it's about the decision making in context. From follow the rule to apply sound judgment under pressure. Because confident decision makers are not people who know every policy. They're people who know how to pause, think, and act responsibly when things get messy. And that's what truly makes compliance training really effective in the real world. Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. A big thank you to Saurabh for helping us to look at the compliance training beyond the usual checkboxes and for showing how it can become a real signal of workforce readiness and risk awareness. And thank you so much to you, Prasoon, as well, for bringing in the tech lens and showing how tools like Articulate can make compliance learning less next slide, and more interactive, measurable, and decision driven. So the next time you see a compliance course, don't just ask, did people complete it? Ask, will they make the right call when it actually counts? Thank you so much everyone for tuning in. We'll see you in the next episode by Stratbeans, where learning conversations get a little sharper, smarter, and a lot more real. Thank you.